Hey everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Please take a second to rate, follow, or subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you're listening to. It's a key performance indicator and helps us reach even more people. Now here's what we've got in store for you today.
Okay, a procedure is never normal. We knew that, and I think you are on edge a little bit, perhaps subconsciously, because, of course there's a risk involved, you know that. We'd left her at 8:30 in the morning. We got a phone call just about 11ish in the morning, and it was the surgeon who basically said, there's been some problems, Elaine's not waking up properly. While she was anaesthetised, it became an emergency, which unfortunately was then handled in a way that wasn't appropriate, and she ended up unconscious after the attempted procedure was abandoned. And he said, so Elaine's been without oxygen for a significant period of time, and we're looking at her having significant brain damage. At that point, the kind of enormity of it hits me. She was transferred to intensive care, and she died 13 days after the original attempted operation. I basically thought I have to have the conversation with the kids that says she's not going to wake up. And that was the hardest conversation. How do you say that somebody's asleep and is never going to wake up and eventually will die?
The Firefighters Podcast is a global podcast seeking to develop, inspire, and motivate the world of the emergency services operators. Through a series of wide-ranging conversations celebrating those within our sector, we seek to encourage and support this incredible group of people. It's brought to you by myself, operational firefighter Pete Wakefield, and I speak with individuals from all walks of life who I sincerely believe can add value to or develop those who have chosen this life path. Please support your emergency services wherever you are in the world, and thank you for listening. Martin, welcome to the podcast. How you doing, brother?
Thank you very much, Pete. Great to be here.
I actually first became familiar with your story, and I know your story is far beyond some of the limitations of what we're going to discuss today. And my hope is, even from our time this morning, it's going to take us in a million different directions anyway, both because of my relentless desire to ask people intrusive, probably, and inappropriate questions, but also the story beyond what we're going to talk about today, because your life is so much more than just this, and you've got a tremendous amount of value that I want to try and drag out of you from the world of aviation as well. But I just want to take a little recap and give us a little introduction about what would first become part of your story, because I think I first heard of it in a book called Black Box Thinking. Yeah. And it feels quite surreal sitting with you. I always feel when I sit down with certain people now, and we kind of get into a weird position with a podcast where I'm sitting, and I almost feel like a massive amount of pressure, because I'm like, Jesus, why on earth is this person sat here with me? But from the initial introduction that I found with you, just give us a little bit of background on Elaine, who we're going to be doing a little bit of discussion about today, and a little bit about what we're going to talk about. Yeah,
sure. So Elaine and I had been married a number of years, 2 young children, Victoria and Adam. Elaine was 37 at the time and was healthy, happy. 2 young children, kind of, dynamic, exciting family life. But she'd suffered some sinus problems. So in other words, she'd have a cold, for example, her nose would get blocked up, but it would persist for a number of weeks.
Is this similar to what some people struggle with when they have snoring issues? Because people can have...
I've no idea about that. That might be true.
Yeah, some people opt for that elective surgery for sinuses. Sorry.
Yeah, so anyway, on one occasion that got so bad it turned into quite a bad infection, and she ended up in hospital on intravenous antibiotics. And the consultant basically said, this is going to happen again and again, and it would be best to get it sorted out. And so the idea was that there's a procedure you can have, functional endoscopic sinus surgery it's called, and the suggestion was that she should go in and have that done, basically. Mm-hmm. It was the lower risk option in the longer term, because if you get an infection in that part of your head, actually it's very close to your brain, and it can become very serious, and we hadn't appreciated that. So Elaine goes in for this routine procedure back on the 29th of March 2005. She was going to be anaesthetised. It's quite a serious procedure in terms of it can take quite a time to recover. It's very uncomfortable, can take a couple of weeks. So happened I was off for 2 weeks anyway, so it's perfect timing. and she was anaesthetised.
Had she had surgery before?
Yes, she had. Yes, she had
That's
had
the first
surgery
time I
before.
ever went under. Some people don't know the distinctions between general and local anaesthetic, and the fact that she was under completely was.
Yes, she was under a general. She'd had a general as a child, and so there were no particular causes for concern in her case. But yes, she was anaesthetised, and problems I gathered later had occurred. While she was anaesthetised, it became an emergency, which unfortunately was then handled in a way that wasn't appropriate, and she ended up unconscious after the attempted procedure was abandoned. She was transferred to intensive care, and I had to make the decision 5 days later to switch her life support off, and she died 13 days after the original attempted operation.
That I've heard that story before. My brother-in-law was a paramedic, and this is something that is used extensively in the medical profession. Not as well, yes, as an alarm bell, and also some of the changes you've been part of. But what I don't want to do, I don't want to skip past what you and your family probably had envisaged was going to happen that day, because this was supposed to be a one-day thing, wasn't it? Did you intend to go again that evening and pick her up, and we'll make tea for mummy or whatever? And
it was just a normal a procedure is never normal.
No.
We knew that, and I think you are on edge a little bit, perhaps subconsciously, because of course there's a risk involved, that. But I'd had friends and relatives actually who'd had the same procedure, no big deal, they said, a bit uncomfortable. The hospital had said she will probably be out tonight, might be tomorrow, depending on how things go. So the plan was that we were, in fact, the previous night, Elaine had cooked a meal, a shepherd's pie, so that on the night of the procedure, the day she had the procedure, there was a meal that we could just put in the oven and heat up, sort of thing. And for that particular day, I just went back home with the kids. My brother came down as well with his kids, and we were just going to have a day, and I was waiting for a phone call, and that was about it, really.
What was the children's perception of what mummy was going to have done, or what Elaine, was going to have?
So the children were 5 and 4 at the time, and the thought was that this is something that potentially could be scary for them. So we want them to almost be involved. We want them to understand. So it was always deliberate that the children went with us to the hospital, that they came into the I don't know what you want to call it, the pre-op, when they were kind of doing the blood pressure on Elaine and all that. So the kids were hanging around.
A gown on, and
exactly.
And look, and now she's going to have a thing. And she's got a needle in her arm.
Yeah,
it's important to desensitise us to some of those things.
It is, and it was just to say, this might be scary, but actually this is a good thing because Mum is healthy, but we want to make her more healthy. So it was always kind of very low key, relaxed. Okay, Mum is off for the operation. Let's head home. Let's go and pick up some cookies on the way home and sort of thing. And so I think it was kind of very low key, really, in that respect.
This is something that I speak to a lot of people in frontline work and things like that about, this disparity between real life and what they do in their professional capacity. Because as we're going to get onto in a little bit, you exist in the aviation world. You're a pilot. You fly for a main UK airline. So you are possibly, and again, I'd love for you to expand on it or correct me, you're possibly slightly desensitized to risk in a certain way as well. You're very aware of it, and you've got hundreds and thousands of precision procedures, but you are more accepting of, have the right things been put in place? Have we, tried to mitigate any risk? So is there any difference between that and perhaps how some people might react? And how did you personally react when you first had that phone call that things weren't necessarily as we had hoped they'd been? What was your comprehension of how complicated it was, and what did you think was going to happen when you received the phone call in the afternoon?
So I think the first thing to say is, risk is a part of everything we do as a pilot. I'm very aware of that. At work, I professionally risk assess, if you like. I don't mean bits of paper all filled out. I mean actually in my head and with my colleagues, we risk assess whatever we're about to do. We talk about threats, we talk about potential errors and all those sorts of things. So and I completely accept that that's part of life. That is life. Everything we do carries risk. And I think it's very healthy for people to grow up understanding that and being able to make some of their assessments about that. So I suppose I take a fairly objective view about it.
That can be difficult for people around you at times, though.
Yeah,
because I've had, so we call it feedback, even from members of my family about this. I always talk about the empathetic exhaustion, where they're like, "Oh, you seem a little bit cold," or that was a bit rude, or that was a bit abrupt. And then for me, it's like, well, I'm controlling the controllables, and I'm respecting that person's professional capability to do that. But it must be very different when it's happening inside the walls of your own family.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is that you asked about the phone calls. So Elaine, we'd left her at 8:30 in the morning. We got a phone call just about 11ish in the morning, and it was the surgeon who basically said, there's been some problems. Elaine's not waking up properly, and there was a pause on the end of the line, and I was, do you want me to come in? And he said, yes, I think you should, yeah. So, but I was like, okay, so not waking up properly. Well, okay, so she's clearly is waking up, but just there's some issues, and hey, you've been anaesthetised, you're going to be a bit dopey afterwards anyway, whatever, yeah. So no big deal, really. I left the kids with my brother, drove to hospital. And
what did you tell the children at that time? Sorry.
I just said I'm going in to check on mummy or something like that. I don't remember saying anything, and I'm not sure that they would have picked up on
4
that.
4 and 5 is a very middle ground of starting to get an appreciation of the adult world, but still very, not naive, but the level of awareness would not be appropriate, I suppose.
Yeah, so I went into hospital and I was met by the surgeon and also by the anaesthetist. And the anaesthetist basically said, that when we'd anaesthetised Elaine, her airway had collapsed. That does happen sometimes. We
say it collapsed. Sorry.
Yeah.
Because we anaesthetise somebody, it's an aspect of muscle relaxant. They try and sustain their own breathing themselves. I don't know the levels of anaesthesia. I don't know. Probably neither of us do, but I don't know.
No, and I don't either. So what he was just trying to explain.
How many layers of the person do you switch off?
Yes.
They want to still breathe on their own, or was she to rely on external
so the
breathing?
plan was she would breathe on her own, although I didn't know that at that time.
He didn't need to know either. They were going to do it. Yeah.
Her airway collapsed. We had problems getting oxygen to her, and I said, I don't watch, medical programs and casualty and things like that.
You can watch the surgery you're going to go and have.
Yeah.
I don't know if that helps or if it's even right. I don't know.
So, but I did know that there's something called a tracheostomy where you can put a cut in somebody's throat.
Yeah.
And I kind of said, did you think about putting a cut in her throat? And he said, well, the oxygen levels weren't sustained at a low level. They were fluctuating. And the safer option was to let her wake up. Unfortunately, she's not waking up properly, so we transferred her to intensive care. So going back to your original question, which is about being very objective and perhaps cold and rational, at this stage I'm thinking, okay, so there's been a problem. They've done the right things. They've transferred her to intensive care. Yeah, I still get that completely. So at the moment, I'm not feeling fear.
No.
I'm feeling anxious, but not over-anxious. And so they got a nurse to lead me off to the intensive care unit. And the first thing she said to me was, "Are you okay?" And I said, "Yeah." And I kind of thought, that's a very strange question to ask. So she leads me across to intensive care. She
There's a suggestion that you shouldn't be.
Yeah. And she leaves me at the door because there's a call bell, basically, a buzzer, an intercom, and she explains you just need to press the buzzer. So I pressed the buzzer and I said, "This is who I am." And a female voice answered and said, "Okay, we're working with your wife at the moment, so can you go across the corridor to the waiting room?" And that concept of working with your wife, so my mental model now is that Elaine's sitting up in bed, she's talking to them, they're doing blood pressures or whatever.
They're prepping her to meet me.
Yeah, So again, okay, that's all right. So I went in the waiting room, and I don't know when it was, maybe 10 minutes later. Two doctors come in. And one of them says to you, so what have you been told? And I just said, well, a few problems, not waking up properly, but, it's okay. And he said, well, so Elaine's been without oxygen for a significant period of time, and we're looking at her having significant brain damage. And at that point, the kind of enormity of it hits me.
Today's podcast was brought to you by our friends over at Willingwood Watches. On the 27th of April, Willingwood Watches launched their new limited edition watch, the Bronze Triumph Jubilee. This was launched to celebrate the Queen's Jubilee this year, and it's the first time ever they have produced a bronze version of their beloved Swiss-made Triumph collection. They are using specially repurposed purple hose, that's easy for me to say, and still keeping it in keeping with the bronze Swiss-made chronograph watch. There is no better way to commemorate the Queen's Jubilee with that plum violet, but of course you can get your combination of the straps as well. They've got the red, the blue, the yellow, the green. I'm sure you are all well aware of Willingwood Watches. They make those incredible luxury watches from upcycled firefighting equipment. They have been with us since the very origins of the podcast, and you can find out more from them by heading over to willingwoodwatches.com. Now back to the show.
And before I've got a chance to do anything, he says, but we're worried now that because of what's going on, there's a possibility of her suffering cardiac arrest, so we'd like to perform a tracheostomy and we need your permission. And so I said, yeah, of course, yeah, whatever. But
Why do you need your permission?
I don't know. But whatever unwittingly what he did was he went straight from a very emotional situation that, serious brain damage, right through to an objective, we need your help. And suddenly that kind of allowed me a moment of rationality, I suppose. And
it empowers you to think perhaps you're part of the solution
yeah,
now.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And in a
You've
way...
got a plan, you want the green light, let's go.
Yeah. And in a way, in the period of time that Elaine was in intensive care, which, as I say, was 13 days, yes, this is unbelievably emotional, but there were lots of times when I was very involved in what was going on. They'd have a multidisciplinary team meeting. They'd say, well, this is the issues, this is what we're thinking. To each, this were meetings where they were discussing what they were going to do. But I was allowed to be part of that, and I'd say to them, well, look, I don't understand what you're talking about, but what's the risks of doing what you've just described? What's the benefits? What are the options? And actually that allowed, so there was always that objective side there, but it was a constant switching between the emotional and the objective. And obviously, when I went back home each night or whenever, again, I had time driving to think about how can I objectively deal with this for the sake of the children. So
what was the first night? So they perhaps were under an impression that Mummy might be coming home today. She might not be. She's not today. When is she? Is Mummy in the car? No, she's not in. What happened at first?
So I soon after I'd had this news, in the waiting room, as it were, that things weren't right. And again, I was asked, can you wait a bit longer while we perform a tracheostomy or whatever we were going to do? I made some phone calls, and I made a phone call to my brother, and I just said, look, just tell the kids that there's a few issues and that Mummy won't be back yet, but I'll come back later this evening. And I gather he had those conversations, and it was just like a shrug of the shoulders. And in fact, I didn't really speak to the children. I did get home that night and have a brief conversation with the children. I said, yeah, Mummy's okay, but there's some issues, she'll be fine. And it was only in the morning, after breakfast, when I was able, or before breakfast, when I was able to say that, their grandmother, my mum, had a stroke a year or so earlier. And she'd had this stroke for a week. She was basically unconscious in a hospital bed. And at the time, we thought she wasn't going to survive. But then 6 months later, she was pretty much back to normal. Not perfect, but she was the kind of grandmother that the kids knew and loved, sort of thing. Yeah. So I said, okay, you remember your grandmother? And I'm not sure Adam did because of his age, but Victoria did. I said, you remember how she was? and she was ill, and then actually, and I said, I think it's going to be like that with your mum. She's going to be unwell for a little while and it'll be sick, but she'll be fine. And I guess kids at that age don't really understand what 6 months is. So it was like
that's a great. And I might be subconscious or conscious, but it's that aspect when people are trying to demonstrate somebody something is take them from the known to the unknown.
Yeah.
Take them from you know this. It's like this, but this.
Yeah.
Take them from something where they can see, because sometimes it's like when you're trying to learn something new or you don't comprehend something, it's like walking into a cave and it's just darkness. I don't understand any of it. But if you go, you remember that cave we went into before and then there was a light at the end of it? This is like that cave, except this time we're going to go left and right. But there's still a thing at the end. There's still a point at which normality will continue.
Yeah, and I don't, but it's interesting as I look back on it, because although I was being quite objective, I wasn't really prepared because I didn't know what they were going to ask children at any point. And
they're both wonderfully and scarily
Yeah.
surprising with the things that they can say.
Yeah, and it was just kind of thinking on my feet and hoping that whatever came out was helpful. Yeah. And certainly for the first few months, that was how my life was. It was living in the moment because that was all I could do, really, and thinking on my feet a lot of the time. So
is that like an intensified version of, and again, I apologise for jumping all over the place, but an intensified version of your professional career as well, because there must be elements, and I'm sure we're going to get into the weeds of the training and stuff that goes on, but knowledge is a dangerous thing sometimes if you are not able to sort of take it in and contextualize it as to what it means in your own reality. And you must have had many instances in the past, nowhere near similar to this perhaps, but you're aware of something, there's a terminology's all off, there's a blip on the radar, or there's a weather front, or there's something that you could see potentially materializing into an issue, but I've got several solutions I'm going to try before I need to make anybody else concerned about it. And again, you may make other people in your inner circle, that which in this case is your brother, in that case maybe cockpit, stewardess, staff, whatever it may be. Don't need to let the people on the plane know at this point in time. It's not at that level. So there is a spectrum of input and knowledge which is remotely useful to anybody without triggering that emotional response, which you may not have an answer for, I suppose.
Yeah, I suppose there is, but I think the difference is when I'm at work, it's extremely rare that you're going to be faced with a situation that is really so novel that you've got no concept of where to go with it.
You have a much bigger sphere of control in your professional world.
Whereas in this case, I was just completely lost most of the time. I had no idea what I was doing, and I'm sure if I look back on that stage in my life, I can think, well, actually I didn't do the right thing there, or I didn't do the right thing here. But I think at the time I worked with what I had, and I took as much advice as I could, but I was swimming in the dark.
So as we move through those 13 days, when did the conversation shift from we're making improvements to we're running out of solutions?
So the general plan was that Elaine would be kept in a medically induced coma for a few days, because the brain is like any kind of part of the body. If you hit it, it bruises. And it swells basically, and so the danger of the brain being starved of oxygen, which is what had happened in effect, was that the brain swells and it damages itself on the skull. So medically induced coma, the brain is not swelling, and the plan was then to reduce the level of the depth of that coma over time, to allow her to start to become conscious, and hopefully the brain wouldn't swell. That was the plan. Unfortunately, when they started to reduce that sedation, in fact, it became obvious that there had been significant swelling of the brain already, and that in reality this was too late. And I remember, and this would be 3-4 days in, I was shown where they said, would you like to see the brain scan? And obviously, I'm not a medical person, so I don't know what I'm looking at, but I do know from television roughly what a brain should look like. It's that kind of cauliflower shape, if you know what I mean. and it's got some form of structure and form, whereas what we were looking at was like looking at static on a television. It was as if it was just, clearly there was nothing useful there. And I said, I just said to the doctor, I said, so what happens now? And he said, well, in effect, the higher workings of the brain are probably gone, and eventually, the brain stem will die, which is the part that controls the breathing and the autonomic stuff. And the anticipation was she would die naturally within a matter of hours, and she didn't. And that following morning, one of the doctors came to me and just said, has anybody spoken to you about, maybe switching her life support off? And I said, no, but that's what she would want.
100%.
And we'd had that conversation bizarrely. Not that we didn't have many deep conversations like that, but a program we'd watched on television about brain damage had just posed the question at one point a year or so earlier, what would you do? And I both felt strongly that no, that once you're in that kind of vegetative state, then there's no life. Whether that's right or wrong, that was our view, and so I knew that was appropriate. But they were very good. Again, they took me into a multidisciplinary meeting, and they discussed it amongst themselves, and they basically said to me, Martin, we hear what you're saying, but we're not totally 100% on this, because although we agree she's almost certainly going to die, there are other indications which are strong. For example, her heart is still very strong and things like that. So we just need to debate this. And I just said, that's fine. Just take your time. Let's make sure this is right. And it
That's
took
where I suppose it's the Hippocratic Oath comes into play, isn't it? Where if there is any indication we can sustain some form of quality of life, and that's a very wide spectrum, we have a professional obligation to do so. And that's what must be a very sticky ground between what your moral compass suggests you think you should do versus what they are professionally obliged to do.
Yeah, and I don't know is the answer. And in a way it was kind of irrelevant. I just wanted to, if they said to me, no, Martin, we're not happy, then I would have said, okay. But I wanted to allow them the time to work that out and come back to me. And it took a couple of days before I got a phone call from the head of the intensive care unit, and he said, yeah, we're happy to grant your wish now. So life support was withdrawn, and again in anticipation that Elaine would die very quickly, and in fact she didn't. And heart and other vital functions remained strong for a number of days. But certainly, I say now, yes, she lived for 13 days after the operation. But at the time, we had no idea. And I remember a phone call one evening from a friend of mine, and she said, have you got any idea what might happen? And I said, no. I said, she could be dead now. She could be last year's. I simply don't know where we'll go with this. But she interestingly, she asked me another question, which has kind of stuck with me, and I think it kind of gives an idea of what's going on in your mind in these times. Like a lot of, people, I'm always kind of thinking ahead, planning ahead in my life. I'm thinking about what am I doing tomorrow? What am I doing next year? And she said to me, what are your long-term plans? And I said to her, my long-term is the next hour. I don't have long-term. And that's absolutely true. I did not know what was going to, I couldn't have told you what I was going to do for breakfast in the morning or what I was doing tomorrow. It was kind of wake up, go with it, do what seems right. And it took a number of months really before I was in a better place to be able to think ahead, if you know what I mean, and get back to the sort of person I used to be. And I guess that's a defence mechanism, because actually there is no point in thinking ahead about all these things. Now, actually, it was that evening that I got the phone call to say that Elaine had died.
Today's episode is supported by our good friends over at Duty Crew Coffee. Now, as you're probably aware, coffee is the most popular drink worldwide, with over 2.25 billion cups of coffee consumed every single day, and over 70 million of those in the UK alone. Most of this is consumed in our crew rooms, our watch offices, and by our emergency services frontline staff. So when you're getting together around the mess table, don't be drinking no nasty ass cheap coffee. Nobody likes that guy that brings the cheap stuff. Life is too short to be drinking crap coffee. So if you head on over to dutycrew.co.uk or click the link in the podcast below, you'll be able to jump on over and see the Duty Crew coffee products. They come in 227 gram, oversized, high quality, recyclable stand-up pouches, and they are individually wrapped 10 gram coffee bags. They're quick, mess-free, convenient. They have a one-way degassing valve, which is an absolute must for storage of freshly roasted coffee. You can get the 20-pack response bag. They've got the HQ, they've got the No Duff, they've got the Unity, the Decaf, and of course, all of their products are Rainforest Alliance certified, Fair Trade Foundation, and most importantly, they taste freaking epic. I started drinking Duty Crew about 2 months ago, and then when I fell in love with it, I got in contact with them and they came on board with the podcast. So jump on over to Duty Crew Coffee if you want some of the good stuff. Now back to the podcast.
How did you share that information with the children? I'm not going to dwell on this point. I don't want to ask too
No,
many
no,
questions
that's
around
fine.
it.
No, it's fine.
Only because so many people that we go to incidents with, and it's one of the first things sometimes I hear them say, what am I going to tell X?
Yeah.
What am I going to tell my husband? What am I going to tell the children? And I can never quite find...
Yeah, so there were two conversations. I think that's important to say because obviously I had to make the decision to switch Elaine's life support off. And the night after that, and the children had been coming to hospital with me, not the whole day, but they would come maybe every other day for an hour or so. But it was always do you want to see mum? And some days they said no, and then other occasions they said yes. But, you know, she was asleep, although she had lots of wires. It wasn't dramatic. There was no blood or anything like that. It was just Elaine, but asleep with some wires attached.
And children can be strangely innocent in those moments.
Yeah, they can, yeah. And
they can even just, why is Molly asleep?
Yeah.
Why is she asleep? Because
Yeah.
she's not able to be awake at the moment.
Yeah.
Like, it's got to be so, I can't even imagine. And
Yeah.
I know a lot of time has passed. They're just surreal
Yeah.
to pulling forces in your head of not just continually, but because it's exhausting. So I know we're going to go into mental exhaustion in a little bit, but just exhausting to try and be a dad, be present, have any aspect of levity to life, but still have that enormous, colossal weight of, God, don't ask me that question.
I think, to be honest with you, again, I couldn't even think ahead to what they might ask, and I just responded at the time. But I think the big thing was that the massive support I had was a network of friends who were offering to do this, that, and the other, look after the kids, whatever. And somebody said to me at one point, they said, you know, if somebody phones you up and says, do you want me to do X for you? Don't think about it, just say yes. Because they want to help, and actually it's something less for you to think about. So that was a massive
Allows
help.
people to feel like they've got some significance, like I'm part of the solution in some way or another. But it takes a lot of humility to allow people to do that as well, because some people are very proud and they suffer far more than they should.
Yeah. But going back to the original question, which was about the conversation, so when Elaine's life support was switched off the next morning, I basically thought I have to have the conversation with the kids that says she's not going to wake up. And that was the hardest conversation. How do you say that somebody's asleep and is never going to wake up and eventually will die? And this sounds a really strange thing to say, but we'd had a pet cat that had died a couple of years previous. And I said, you know, you remember our cat who died, and, you know, we buried him and we never saw him again. And I basically said, well, that's what death means. That's what's going to eventually happen to your mum. And that was just a terrible conversation. And so when Elaine did die, again, the next morning I had to have the conversation. And although you'd think it would be easier on me and easier on the children, it was just as terrible. And again, it's interesting because I was told a number of times, and you've already alluded to it, I think that children don't tend to understand. I think they understand more than people realise. And I think having had the experience of the pet cat, they had some sense in a way. Although even 2 to 3 months after Elaine had died, there was still this element of, it was never said, but it was almost that feeling of, okay, joke's over, where is she, sort of thing. It was that, this can't be real.
Well, people, like we've said, you know, I mean, and I know I've guiltily asked the question, you know, what did you say, blah, blah, what did you say? But like you said, a very small percentage of what we communicate is verbal. So they're not, well, no, people don't say they're stupid, but they're not stupid. They pick up on all of these subconscious non-verbal cues, your mood, your intonation, those changes in your behavior. And then, like you said, death is, it comes in loads of stages, and also the stages don't move sequentially. You can jump around them, and there's so many anchors in life. You open the kitchen drawer and, oh, Jesus, Mom, yeah. You go in the room, you go in the thing, and all of those mental triggers say that person, or the cat, or the cat's bedding, the cat's tea, the cat's this, the fork we use to get every time, and the cycle jumps back, and then it's guilt, and then it's anger, and then it's tears, and then it's guilt again, and then it's and I imagine that happens almost indefinitely. It's the severity of the flame every time it ignites will be less, but I don't imagine it ever fully goes.
Yeah, I think it is I think it's a very individual journey for everybody, that's true. But it is also, what I discovered very quickly was that, people die, we get it, we see it on television, famous people have died, relatives die, and it's sad, and we kind of deal with it. But we don't really face it in life until it's somebody immediate to you, who is in your life all the time. So it is the great taboo. We think about, we argue about sex education, and sex is the big taboo, or whatever it might be, but actually it's death. Death is the one thing that we don't even talk about as an adult. And I think that's a problem for society. There's a lovely book by a doctor by the name of Catherine Mannix, With the End in Sight, or With the End Near. I don't remember the exact term. And I only read it a few months ago. And it's not the normal sort of book I would read, but I just thought actually it was amazing. It was actually a very positive book about death, and she was particularly looking not at sudden, unexpected death, but at people who've got terrible terminal conditions and that. But I just thought, that's a very positive view. And her speciality was, being a doctor on a ward where the patients were terminal, end of life care. And her observations, I just thought, were very, very appropriate. But it is definitely the big taboo that we don't talk about.
A quick reminder for all of our listeners of our monthly giveaway. Now, as part of our partnership with Hikes, Rosenbauer and Tallyman, we give away that little bit extra to our podcast listeners every single month. You can get 2 personalized BA tallies. These are hardware, and they've got your own name on them, they've got your own service number on them, and they have the podcast logo on the back. And then for the juicy stuff, Hikes give away a pair of their incredible footwear. And some of the stuff is pretty expensive stuff, to be honest with you. We try and switch it and change it every month. We are guided by the gods of Hikes to make sure we are giving you exactly what you need for that time of year. So it might be boots, it might be trainers, and then once every quarter our good friends over at Rosenbauer are giving away their Boros B5 firefighting boots as well. So to be in with a chance to win, jump over to our social media platforms or YouTube, where you need to tag a member of the emergency services in the post, be following our page, and you will be in with a chance to win at the end of every single month. Back to the show.
There's several threads that make me want to pull on there, because I absolutely agree with you, and I found it difficult with my children. I don't find it difficult with my children, actually. I find it difficult with the other people in my family when communicating with my children about trying to bring it into the conversation. So whenever I experience a death at work, I will try and go into an appropriate level of depth, but I will certainly bring it into the conversation and really allow my daughter, especially, she's nearly 10 now, but even from a very young age, to talk about it, to ask loads of questions. And with grandparents especially, and again, it's probably more of a generational shift, although I think it's still prevalent in society, as you said, is that we tend to vilify it. We look at it as it's an unfortunate thing, but it's also a very natural thing. And it's part of everybody. None of us are getting out alive at the end of the day. So I always say to my daughter, ask questions about it, talk about it. It's upsetting, but it's not something that we shouldn't look forward to it, but we certainly shouldn't vilify it, and we shouldn't think of it as something that we can't discuss. So I've always encouraged her to try and discuss it. And when you said about that book, I made a note of it, Carolyn Maddox. We'll try and find a reference to it and put it in the notes. I did a lot of work in a previous occupation, which was spoken about before, and part of the charity work that we did was working with Rainbow's Hospice. Very surreal, very surreal. And we obviously a lot of Rainbow Hospice, for people unfamiliar, do a lot of end-of-life care with
Yeah.
children. Again, such a really awkward, and maybe the fact that I even say that echoes the fact that I'm not normalising it, the fact that it's end-of-life and it's children. And one of the things they did, which I found a very difficult room to be in, I actually walked straight out first and then had to go back in afterwards. They have a room where they give children the opportunity to orchestrate or narrate or put together the music for their own funeral, and they get the opportunity to design a track. And I found that a very difficult thing to comprehend. But again, the way it was described to me was that, and we've spoke about it a few times here, is it gives the person something to control, an aspect of control over this thing that they can't control. In every other instance, they are just the victim. They are the victim in this entire scenario. And it gives them something to be in control of. But I found it very difficult. And we did a number of charity events there a couple of years. And I am, ironically, even doing the podcast, I'm known for putting my foot in my mouth. And I remember going back a few years and saying, "Oh, hey, how are you? Blah, blah, how's Johnny?" And they're like, "Oh, he's not with us anymore, but thank you." And the parents would continue to go because they created links, and they'd go year after year to celebrate the place. Incredible work. And again, I'm sure people say it to you, "I couldn't do your job." "Oh, Peter, I couldn't do your job. Couldn't do an NHS job." I couldn't do that job, I don't think.
No, and I couldn't either. And in fact, my niece does do that job, end-of-life care for children. And just incredibly difficult.
The Firefighters Podcast is a global podcast seeking to develop, inspire and motivate the world of the emergency services operators. Through a series of wide-ranging conversations celebrating those within our sector, we seek to encourage and support this incredible group of people. It's brought to you by myself, operational firefighter Pete Wakefield, and I speak with individuals from all walks of life who I sincerely believe can add value to or develop those who have chosen this life path. Please support your emergency services wherever you are in the world, and thank you for listening.